Welcome to the African University's Hub for Human Rights podcast. I'm your host, Neo Fumba, researcher for the Hub, bringing you conversations with activists, scholars, and change makers across the African continent. Welcome back to the Africa Hub podcast, where we have critical and reflective conversations with human rights activists and scholars. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Albert Nyiti, a doctoral researcher from Humboldt-University of Berlin, a research fellow at Ardhi University in Tanzania, and Albert is currently a visiting scholar at the Politics and Urban Governance Research Group at the University of the Western Cape. Today, we will be diving into conversation about the right to adequate and affordable housing, looking at the challenges and pathways to a just city. Welcome, Albert.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me, Leah.
All right. So can you just please tell us briefly about your research and why is it of interest to you, and just reflect on your visit to South Africa as well.
Great. So my study aims at conducting the situated analysis of housing self-building practices in the peripheries of Dar es Salaam. And I'm doing this research so as to be able to inform social housing policy in the country. And it's of interest to me because we don't have a housing policy in place. And because we don't have a housing policy in place, it's very important that we do grounded research that can really be able to inform the kind of policy that we need in the country. But I think later on in the discussion, I will just, I'll get the opportunity to be able to explain further what that means as far as the legal and institutional framework for housing is concerned in Tanzania. But in a nutshell, that's what it is. So so far, I mean, you asked about me being in South Africa. I came to South Africa because of this Erasmus Mobility Exchange between my university, where I do my PhD, Humboldt, and so we usually have this exchange mobility for students within Erasmus partnership universities. And so the University of Western Cape is a partner of Humboldt-University, and I was able to take this opportunity and be able to come and conduct my research while I'm here. So I'm actually in the writing phase of my PhD.
Oh, lovely to hear that. It's so interesting, to be in conversation with different individuals, activists, and scholars from across the continent to see, what is happening in your country, what is happening in my country. And it's interesting to learn that Tanzania doesn't have, a housing policy or affordable housing policy, to put it that way, because in South Africa, we do have some policies in place, especially because of our history with apartheid, to readdress those issues. And there's something called the Social Housing Regulatory Authority that looks at your income bracket, and if you do fall under there, you're able to get affordable housing. So it's interesting to see what's happening. So just to continue with our conversation, what is your assessment of the current state of affordable housing in Tanzania, particularly in urban centers like Dar es Salaam?
Well, that's a very interesting question. So, to begin, I would like to let you know this one fact about Tanzania, that all land is public land vested into the president. And that's very, very important to note given our situation. So this means no one is owning land in Tanzania, everyone is leasing. And that being the case, you would assume that maybe the government should be the one providing housing because it's the one owning all the land, because you cannot have housing in isolation of land. You need land so that you can actually be able to, realize housing. But, post-independence, so, and this is one of the most important points that I usually like to clarify. Before independence, when, the nationalists, Mwalimu Nyerere and company, when they were fighting to get independence for Tanganyika then, one of the main agenda that they used to propagate their movement for independence was housing poor Africans. And by poor Africans here, I mean poor Tanganyikans. It was so, it was a very important agenda to the point that soon after we got our independence we got our independence on 9th December 1961. In 1962, the first parastate organization that was formed in the country was the National Housing Corporation. So this man really was, he really meant business, and he truly put housing central to the national agenda. And you can see that was something very important. But then fast forward 40 years later, unfortunately, given there have been, if you trace, I wouldn't, because there's a lot that I could say about how it trickled down to how the national housing was in the past doing very good work, but then in the 1970s and 80s, actually, when the structural adjustment programs came, it was really tough for the National Housing Corporation to be able to do what it was supposed to initially. So I think shortly, unfortunately, the National Housing Corporation has now become the biggest real estate government-owned agency, and it's operating under commercial terms. So it's very unfair to expect, I understand the situation because it's a change of policy. It's very unfair to expect a commercial entity to provide affordable housing, and they are after profit, and they need, probably they go for more, loans to do this project. So it's understandable. But then this leaves majority of the urban population, 70% of which live or depend on the informal economy to access land, access land and access housing within the informal land and housing delivery system. And, that is something that you cannot, I would say you cannot ignore. And somehow the urban poor, or majority of the urban population, have been able to provide housing for themselves. And most of this, this production is happening in the peripheries of the cities, because that's where the land is cheap and they mobilize themselves. So self-building is the most prominent modality for accessing housing and or for realizing housing for that matter. And we're looking at more than 90% of houses being built by the people.
Oh, wow. It's interesting. I think you mentioned that all land is owned by the state, whereas in South Africa, we do have private property. We also have state-owned property. So already you can see the comparison between the two countries when it comes to issues of land, quite different, but also similar in a sense. Just to reflect, how has rural-urban migration patterns influenced the demand of affordable housing in the cities?
Well, I'll give you an example of like Dar es Salaam. Dar es Salaam is the economic capital of Tanzania, and it has been projected that by 2030 it will become a mega city. And this is not just by, the increase in population is not merely by just people being born within the urban areas. No, there's a lot of people who move into Dar es Salaam in pursuit for better lives, employment. And this has, for the past, say, 40, 50, or even 60 years, it has been put a lot of pressure onto, the need for land and housing. And obviously, the government machinery has fell short in providing formal land and housing for the people. It has tried. It had a number of projects. We had the slum clearance, the sites and service projects, and but then the 20,000 plots projects in Dar es Salaam. But then, unfortunately, the number of people, the demand for land and housing has ever been increasing. and the supply by the government fell short. And I think it's also very important to notice the role of the shift of the government pre the structural adjustment and post the structural adjustment programs. Tanzania used to be a socialist country in the 1960s. We had the Arusha Declaration in 1967. So during this time, the government was the provider of housing. But post structural adjustment programs, it went into becoming the enabler. And I think the one good thing that I would say the government has, has been positively helping, the community or Tanzanians in general is the fact that after the land policy in 1995 and the Land Act, the Village Land Act and Urban Land Act and Village Land Act and Land Act of 1999, it was then that both the formal and informal housing land delivery systems were acknowledged. So yes, we do have now, I think it's appropriate to say that there are land sector-based policies and acts that have paved way for people to access land and be able to realize housing, that is, build their own housing. So yes, as the enabler, the government acknowledges informal land delivery. And so if you acknowledge informal land delivery, it means you acknowledge informal housing delivery, right? So in a way, I am in a way, the government has been able to enable the people to be able to access housing. So I would say, yes, rural-urban migration has been an issue, but somehow, given the situation in the country or the land-based policies and acts, the government has been able to indirectly accommodate the people within urban areas.
Okay. You touched on the structural adjustment programs. We also had, post 94, we had the RDP, and many other different programs to ensure that we are trying to redistribute what's happening prior to that, to have people have access. Yeah. But of course, there's barriers to these, which then leads into the next question of what are the main barriers to affordable and adequate housing in Dar es Salaam? And, how do these barriers affect social equity?
Well, I would say, first, it would really help to say that, to accept or to realize that, not realize, I think the right word should be to acknowledge that housing is a right. And of course, the Article 24 of the Constitution acknowledges the right to own property, but property is very wide. It could just be land, but acknowledging that housing is a right, I think that's the entry point to, begin the discussion and be able to bring housing back to the national agenda. And I think another very important thing is that we need now to have a designated legal and institutional framework for housing. I think that's very, very essential to be able to unlock the potential that housing can provide both to the people and to the economy of the country. So having a housing policy will really help, and that's a major, major barrier as far as we are concerned, as far as access to affordable housing. And another major barrier is the cost of building materials. It's just too much. We're looking at 40% of the cost for housing being on, the cost of building materials. And this is something that the government could take into account, maybe subsidize, because we have an 18% VAT on every building materials. And, there's VAT when the wholesalers are getting the materials from the manufacturers, and there's an 18% when the wholesalers are selling to retailers, and there's another 18% when the people are buying the materials from them, and then you have to, transport this much. It's just too much. It's too much, and I think this is something that is a major barrier. But then one other thing that I'd like to shed a light on is that access to housing finance is a major barrier to affordable housing, with the fact that you're looking at, as I mentioned earlier, that 70% of the people rely on the informal economy. So they cannot justify formally, what they're making, and, have their money in the bank and be able to make this down payments. And sometimes there are people who actually can afford the 25% maybe down payment for housing, but they do not have, a proper cash flow that can be seen formally for them to be able to maybe qualify for, this mortgage. But we do have housing microfinance initiatives. We've seen what we used to call human settlements. I think they did some really amazing work in the past maybe 15, 20 years, but I think it has morphed into something new now. But we also have like initiatives by the people, like housing cooperatives. We have them. A good example I usually like to mention, which is also a case study for my PhD, is the Federation for the Urban Poor, who have been able to build their own housing in a place called Chamazi in the southern part of Dar es Salaam. So there are barriers, but there are also some really nice initiatives that have been happening that could, potentially help to realize affordable housing in the country.
That's true. And as you spoke about policy in South Africa, I think a few months ago we had our expropriation without compensation of land being passed, which caused
Yes.
quite a stir,
Yes,
And
yes.
I think there needs to be more education for, all citizens to understand what that act wants, what was amended in the act, and how it is aiming to redistribute, sorry, land to people. And people are saying, but how can you take land without compensation? But then we say, if you look at the history, then what is your argument, take into consideration our history. But yeah, there's a lot of conversation that continually has to happen for us to reach, I think, a utopia social equity when it comes to issues of land. Okay. And then, as I tie on to the next question, what does the concept of a just city mean in the Tanzanian context? And what is the synergies between just city and access to housing?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and a big one, I must say. So maybe I should begin by saying that I'm part of an initiative or a coalition called the Just City Platform in Tanzania. We call ourselves the Housing Working Group, and the coalition is composed of people working in academia, people from civil societies, CBOs, and we also have community members who are part of the initiative. And really, what we have been advocating for is bringing back housing to the national agenda and beginning these discussions and doing research and for the first time in March this year, we held the first National Housing Conference and putting together stakeholders so that we can begin this dialogues of bringing back housing to the national agenda. So for us, as a member of the JCP, we do have a number of principles that, following the African Urban Forum that was in Ethiopia and the World Urban Forum that I was privileged to attend, courtesy of the JCP in Cairo, we did come up with principles that we thought, or features that we thought is what the just city is in Tanzania. And this equity, diversity, and inclusion as a concept. We have dignity, respecting respecting people living in informal and planned settlements, democracy, public safety, accessibility, and affordability, and the issue of sustainability. So all these features, I just mentioned them, but I know we don't have the time to take a deep dive into every one of them, but that's pretty much, those are the principles that we've listed as should be taken into account as far as just city is concerned. But we also acknowledge the fact that the just city is an aspiration. It's a utopia for urban scholars, if I must say. It's something that we want to achieve in theory, but in practice, it's impossible to achieve all these principles. But what we can do is, what we are aiming at is striving to achieve, these principles one at a time. And the more you strive to achieve them, the better the outcome is for the people and the community in general. So in a nutshell, that's what a just city is. As far as housing is concerned now, it's how you apply these principles one at a time towards access to affordable housing, and for the special groups that we are interested in, especially the urban poor, the elderly, children, and people with disabilities, and all the special groups that need access to housing. And of course, for my PhD, social, I'm looking into social housing, so it's very important that people who do not have access to housing, or access to affordable housing, or housing that is decent or adequate, get to have through these principles.
Mm-hmm. That is true. Okay, so as we build on, we're moving on to our conversation, does Tanzania have a comprehensive national housing policy that's effective to address affordable housing? If not,
Well, I think,
why not? Why does that gap exist?
well, that's $1 million question right there, by the way. I think I already mentioned earlier that we don't have a housing policy, but what we have is a draft. And this draft has been a draft since 2018. So you can do your maths. I think it's been, 7 years?
Yeah, 7 years.
That it has remained a draft. And we have been advocating for its endorsement by the government for the past 5 years. I think that's what the JCP has been rooting for. But then, unfortunately, it hasn't. That has not been the case. But nevertheless, there are a glimpse of hope that we think the government has been listening. But before I get to that, you are asking why. Yeah. If not, why don't we have it? Well, I think I've written, I've published, co-published papers and research about this in the past. I think in the past 2-3 years, trying to find out, or indicating one of the reasons why this might be the case. And one of them is, I think, the Swahili language has, in one way or another, played a role in how, perhaps, I'm not saying that's the only reason, but could be one of the reasons, because the words settlement and housing are interchangeably used in Swahili. So if somebody says nyumba yangu, or makazi yangu, makazi being settlement and nyumba being house, they could be meaning the same thing. And we were surprised that even with people working in academia, within professional in lands and housing, when we ask them to explain nyumba yake and makazi yake, they couldn't. Most of them, actually all of them, said it's the same thing, that makazi and nyumba is one thing, but when we switch to English, they're like, wait a minute, no, housing is this, and But then, imagine if that's someone who has a profession in lands and housing saying this thing, uh, being unable to differentiate while talking in Kiswahili, and while you switch to English, that's when they have this aha moment, like, no, it's different. So imagine for the majority of Tanzanians, imagine for those who are passing laws and the politicians who are actually responsible for endorsing these policies. So there is a problem, and one of the reasons could be that. And then another interesting reason that I got from one of my mentors, Professor Kironde, in the National Housing Conference in March, he said that perhaps when we went from housing to human settlements, I think this was a drive by the UN Habitat, UN Habitat, when they were pushing for human settlements. I think in Tanzania, somehow we were lost, we were dissolved into human settlements, and we forgot about housing, or housing was swallowed with human settlements. And the argument has always been, okay, why do you need a housing policy if you already have a National Human Settlements Development Policy? Because we do have a National Human Settlement Development Policy of 2000. And also this National Human Settlement Development Policy has been, there was a revision, and I think there's a draft for the 2018 edition that is yet to be endorsed as well. So the discussion has always been around, no, housing is part of human settlements. So why do you need a standalone housing policy? It doesn't make no sense. But then we've been telling them, okay, roads are part of human settlements, but there is a road policy and act, the Road Act. Tell me, solid waste management is part of human settlements. Water supply is part of human settlements, but there is a policy for water and all these acts passed. So what are you trying to say? Housing is a component of the human settlements, but housing is deserves a standalone policy, and it needs a subsequent act that is passed and endorsed by the government, so that we can be able now to provide housing that is appropriate, and acknowledge, define what affordable housing is in the Tanzanian context.
That is true.
Sorry, I was just typing a question. I was like, I was wondering, what does affordable and accessible housing mean in the context of, Tanzania? How does it translate? If you mentioned that language is one of the issues.
Language.
Sorry. So with affordability, you're looking at, there a number of parameters that you could use to define, classify or categorize affordable housing. One of them could be income threshold. Another one could be like a standard unit. And maybe I'll just give an example of the income threshold. And this is like the one that is used by majority of, the people when they define affordable housing, where they would say, if you, whatever your income is on a monthly basis, if you can spend 30, maximum 40% of that income on housing, and the rest on other basic necessities, then that 30 to 40% is what affordable housing is. So the kind of housing that you can access with your 30 to 40% of your income is what is affordable housing is to you. So affordable housing is very, very specific. It's very subjective. Sorry, I meant to say it's very subjective. And what is affordable to me is not necessarily what is affordable to you or to somebody else. So this applies to like groups of people, because we do have different income levels: the middle class, the high income earners, the low income earners. And so it's very difficult to just define by numbers, but it's also very important to identify who are you referring to as far as affordable housing is concerned? I think that's very, very important. And then the issue of accessibility now becomes the matter of availability. How do people access? Is there land available for people to build houses, or are there houses for them to buy or rent? So accessibility is quite a different parameter. So in Tanzania now, if you say the question was, how is affordable and accessibility an issue in Tanzania? I think that's Tanzania doesn't fall. Tanzania is part and parcel of what is happening in the entire of Africa, and it's not what's happening in Tanzania. It's not an isolation. Is not an isolated situation, and I'm saying this to mean that in every African city, in every city in the world, but in every African city, there are people belonging to different income levels, and there are special groups of people. And affordable housing is therefore very subjective. But in the context of Tanzania, I would like to say this. What you see being built in the peripheries by the people, that is what affordable housing is in Tanzania. Yeah. So self-building modality in Tanzania, housing self-building in Tanzania probably, and which is accessed informally, could be the most just way to access housing, and could be what affordable housing is in the country.
That is so true. Especially you saying that, affordability is subjective to each person in their different, income bracket. I think it's the same thing with the social housing year in South Africa. It was, I think, between 3,000 and 22,000 per month. And if you fall outside that bracket, you are not going to qualify for government social housing. And just because I fall outside of that bracket doesn't mean that I am able to afford what is more than that, So there is constant push and pull and subjectivity to everything that you just mentioned. And
I'd like to add just one more thing. So you see, that's with the income threshold. You're talking about falling within a category as far as your income level is concerned. But then there is, I mentioned earlier, standard unit. So here we're saying affordable housing should be adequate, that you should have access to all this, access to water supply, solid waste management system, power supply, roads, and the housing should be adequate in the sense that you have a headroom of 3 meters. The windows should be properly ventilated, cross ventilation and stuff like that. And then there's also one very important element. Like the location of housing is also, subject to affordability, in the sense that if you are commuting more than 1 hour from your area of residence to your area of work, that house is not affordable. So it could be you're falling within this bracket, but you've been far removed from your livelihood. And then you're spending 3 hours one way, or 2 hours one way, or 4 hours on the road to and fro. That's not affordable housing, because at the end of the day, you're using too much time, you're wasting too much time that you could use to be with family and use on your productivity and other things in life that demand, need your time. So, income is one thing, but then in most cases, we also miss out on these very important elements of what make up affordable housing. And I think that it's very essential that we also take into account all these other parameters that make up what affordable housing is.
That is so true, especially like the commuting. I see it here because I'm based in Cape Town, South Africa, and we see the issue of spatial planning of people commuting 2-3 hours to get to work and back.
Yeah, you have the townships here.
Exactly. So when do you spend time? But also, you can't live in the city center because you cannot afford rent.
Exactly.
You cannot afford to buy a house in the city center, or even a flat, So there are so many elements that need to be taken into consideration of what affordable housing means. Yeah. So, we just want to wrap up this session. And lastly, how can urban planning and policy be reimagined or improved to promote just cities that ensure housing as a fundamental human right? Looking at what long-term strategies are needed to ensure that, urban development leads to inclusive and equitable cities. Reflect lastly on the role of government, community, as well as the private sector, across the board. How can those three sectors, participate to ensure that this is then realized to be of the benefit, I believe, benefiting the people more than anything?
Well, so, housing has many actors involved, many key actors involved. And I think it's not just the responsibility of housing experts or just the government or just the private sector. It's of the people themselves. I think we need, I would say, all these stakeholders, all the actors to come together in pursuit to make the housing sector functional, meaningful and functional in the country. And so it's a holistic thing. It's not just people working in isolation. It's a holistic thing. That is first. And for the government, I think the biggest entry point, as I said earlier, is for us to first, from the Constitution, from the national Constitution, which I heard they are talking about, the ruling party is talking about, making a revision of the Constitution, or bringing back, or not bringing back, but having a new Constitution in the next term if they are elected. But so the national Constitution should implicitly and explicitly list housing, list housing as a human right. As a basic human right in Tanzania. So listing housing as a basic human right, I think that's a point number one that should be, stipulated on the national constitution to address the affordable housing issue in Tanzania. And then the second issue would be now that you've acknowledged it's a right, then let's go to having a designated legal and institutional framework for housing. I think that will unlock a lot of potential so that all these actors can now engage in an environment that is properly governed or that is properly stipulated, and everybody knows what their roles are. As of right now, everyone is acting in the best of their interests. So the private sector will act on their own. The people are building on their own. There are no building codes. Even though there is some kind of development control as far as getting building permits, but then how this is being, to what level it's being achieved, really hasn't been, something that we are very proud of. And we would, in order for us to be able to say, okay, now we have a more meaningful and functional housing sector, we need a housing policy, we need a subsequent act, and so that it can be translated into regulations, programs, for affordable housing. So I think that's these two will then allow these other people, these other actors to come together and work. Because right now there are no rules of engagement. We depend on the land policies and land-based legislation and institutional framework to actually access housing. So I think if we're able to do this, and again, I think maybe the last point is that we should acknowledge and appreciate what the people have been able to provide for themselves, despite of the challenges. Because if the government is falling short, but the people have been able to provide for themselves, then there is a lesson to be learned from the ground, from the people, because they're trying to tell you, like, okay, this is how we do it. So maybe if we learn from the best practices, then we will be able to actually inform policy in ways that will be meaningful and functional in the Tanzanian context, because we need to have context-specific policies and not just copy and paste from other places, because our yes, we don't exist in isolation. There is some similarities maybe in South Africa and Kenya and Uganda and all these other countries, but then we also have the context-specific lessons that we could learn from and be able to inform policy and practice in Tanzania.
Yeah,
and maybe just the last thing, I know, I think early this month, the ruling party CCM, Chama cha Mapinduzi, they did, and this is for me saying kudos to them. They launched their manifesto, and in their manifesto, one of the items that they had listed there was affordable housing. So for the first time in more than maybe 40 years, affordable housing is listed back into their manifesto. And I'm hoping this will be also in the manifesto of other, opposition parties, so that, when they go for campaigning for the 2025-2030, term, all of them get to advocate for affordable housing, and we're more than happy to be able to inform them and sit with them, and this is for all political parties, that is, and talk to them about what the key points are, and because we're in favor of having the word out there and making the people understand, because if you talk about housing, you're talking about a basic necessity. You're talking to it's a very sensitive issue that everyone can relate to, everyone, and it wakes up in some kind of physical shell that they call a house. Whatever it is that you're waking up from, that's a house. So if the one who will be able to talk about housing the best in the elections will win the hearts of the people, let alone winning the elections. We don't know what the outcome will be. And I would like to be neutral as far as I'm concerned. But whoever will be able to, talk about housing in the right way will win the hearts of Tanzanians. And I think this, I'm very happy that now the work of the Just City platform has yielded some fruits, and it's something to be proud of, and I'm very happy of the new transformation.
Congratulations on having that, finally tabled.
Asante sana.
Your work is finally paying off.
Yeah.
And little birdie,
our work.
The work of the masses. Yes, work of the masses, because we do not work in isolation. We work together. And a little birdie told me that you have a new ebook out. Can you please tell us about that?
Yeah. So we have this new book on, it's titled Inequality in Working the 24-Hour City. And it was a partnership between Cardiff University, Wits University, and Ardhi University that I work at. And we did 3 case studies in Dar es Salaam, Cardiff, and Tshwane. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And Tshwane. And so in Cardiff, there was a town called Butown, a place called Butown. And then in Dar es Salaam, there's a word called Tandale. And in Tshwane, there's a place called Pomalong. I hope I pronounced that right. That, we did this walking interview. So the beauty about the ebook that we've just co-published is that, first of all, the methodology was very interesting because it entailed doing interviews while walking with the people. So we had like microphones, like the interviewer and the interviewee have microphones, and we were recording all the time as we were doing the walks. And for instance, I'll talk about Dar es Salaam, where I was able to do a number of interviews, was that it was very interesting because the walks were purposeful walks. Like we went for walks that they would take on a daily basis, and for some, like I worked with this guy who was a glass hawker. He sells sunglasses, shades, and as we were walking, he was selling. So he was doing we were not just mimicking the walk, but doing a real walk while having this conversation. So it was very interesting just being able to talk to these people, getting their walking experiences. And, it was a big learning curve for myself and all the other colleagues that were part of the project. So it was, the research was funded by Volvo, VREF. I'm happy that we got to share this one-of-a-kind multimedia research output, with QR codes and videos, and it really helps like people to engage more with the findings, and I'm very happy to just be a part of the project. I think maybe for your viewers or listeners, we can always share the link so that they can be able to download the book and be able to share more. And maybe I think it's only fair that I mentioned the lead of the project was Dr. Margaret Rubin from Cardiff, and we also worked with from WITS. We had Prof. Sarah Charlton, Dr. Priscilla Izar, and Dr. Alex Halligay. I hope I mentioned the second name correct. And then from Dar es Salaam, there was me and a couple of people that helped me at the Institute of Human Settlement Studies at Ardhi University. And it was very interesting. We had more than 30 respondents. And I forgot one more person from Cardiff, Ali Sharif. These were all people that all of us co-produced this output together, and it was really a great experience just being able to be a part of the team and be able to share this experience with everybody.
All right, thank you so much, and I look forward to reading your ebook. Always, interesting to learn from different disciplines. You don't have to be in the discipline to know what's happening around you. So that's all for this episode of the Africa Hub podcast, and thank you so much for joining us. Remember, the Africa Hub is here to support human rights defenders, amplify their voices, and strengthen the ecosystem to protect those who put their lives on the line for freedom and justice. If you'd like to get involved, visit www.pugresearch.org.za to learn more about our initiatives, research, and upcoming events. Until next time, keep up the fight. This is Neo Fumba signing out.